Hello everyone, welcome back. Thanks for joining me again for another episode of Chaos by Tom O'Neill. We're on chapter 2 now. I hope you guys noticed in the description that you can actually get access to this book online, the whole thing. I still think you should go buy the book because there's tons of pictures in it if you want to see. There's a lot of pictures in the book. The version online has no pictures. It's just basically type. But you can follow along there if you want. Let's get started. We are in chapter 2. It's called An Aura of Danger. All right. Live freaky, die freaky. When I started interviews for my premiere piece in April 1999, much of what you've just read was unknown to me. I'd gotten through Helter Skelter, and I knew the murders had left a mark on Hollywood, but that was about all. In a few years, I developed a deep obsession with the case. I have the trial transcript at my fingertips and binders full of press clippings at my disposal. But in the beginning, I was flummoxed. Helter Skelter had captured the story definitively. Its author had ensured that Manson was locked away. How could a magazine feature top that? My earliest weeks of interviews pulled me in different directions. At first, I was compelled by the way the murders had damaged friendships in Hollywood, revealing strong opinions about the era's morality or lack thereof. As I cycled through Hollywood's cliques, I found that I was reigniting 30-year-old rumors and rivalries. Everyone, over time, assigned the blame for the crimes a little differently. I was dealing in memories that had survived decades of erosion. Even my most reliable sources were shaky on the details. A lot of the contradictions I heard centered on the house at Cielo Drive and the decadent scene there in the months before the murders. That house still signified a lot in Hollywood. For some, the death of Sharon Tate and her friends aroused as much fear as it did grief. I could see that for sure. I mean, who wouldn't be afraid if their friends got slaughtered? I would be afraid too. After the murders, the media had blamed Hollywood's unreality and hedonism for having fostered an atmosphere where mass homicide was all but guaranteed. Stephen Robers, the LA bureau chief of the Times, was quoted in Helter Skelter as saying all the stories had a common thread, that somehow the victims had brought the murders on themselves. The attitude was summed up this way: live freaky, die freaky. Now you'll hear some stories that you're like, wow, I can't believe people do live like this, unless I'm incredibly sheltered, which maybe I am. But maybe it was just the 60s, I don't know, but people behaved in a way that is foreign to this girl. The problem was, 30 years later, no one could agree on who had brought the freakiness into the home and why. I had to wonder if there was a conspiracy of silence in Hollywood. So many of the people I spoke to had strong ideas about why these murders had happened, and yet none of them had spoken to the police, and many remained unwilling to go on record with me. Probably just wanted to forget the whole thing happened, although I don't know how you could. The one thing everyone seemed to agree on in Hollywood is that Bugliosi's Helter Skelter motive didn't add up. It is weird. Like, you're gonna slaughter a bunch of people to start a race war. It's a weird motive. It had worn thin with the police and Hollywood insiders, and it was wearing thin with me too. I tried to unpack this idea that Manson chose the Cielo house to instill fear into Terry Melcher, the record producer, whose rejection had apparently so enraged Manson that he activated a race war. See, it's like, as I say it, it sounds silly. It really does. It does sound unbelievable if you think about it. Like, I don't know, what do you guys think? One problem was that Melcher, by all accounts, had no idea that this was why the family attacked his former home. They never told him that they wanted him to be afraid. They didn't follow the murders with any kind of communication to him. According to Bugliosi, Melcher never realized the crimes had anything to do with him until months later when the police got in touch with him. How was this motive supposed to work if Melcher was never apprised of it? That's a good question. The grander scheme underlying Helter Skelter, to start a massive race war by making it look as if Black Panthers were behind the murders, didn't land either. Although Manson was clearly a racist, and while he had a wild eschatological philosophy, No one believed even for a second that black militants were behind these killings, as he'd hoped it would seem. With an eye on other possible motives, I focused on 3 questions in my first weeks of reporting. First, did the victims at the Tate house have something to do with the killers? Second, had Terry Melcher known who the killers were immediately after the crimes and failed to report them to the authorities? Third, and most sensationally, were the police aware of Manson's role in the crimes much earlier than it seemed? Had they delayed arresting the family to protect the victims or Melcher and his circle from scrutiny? You know, these celebrities are very powerful. It's hard to say. They could be being protected. All it takes, you know, if you have enough money and enough, money gives you power in many cases. Here, as neatly as I can tell it, is what I learned in the early frantic weeks of my reporting. Just as important is what I didn't learn, which goes a long way toward explaining how a simple 3-month magazine assignment turned into a 20-year obsession. The dancing was different. Julian Wasser, a photographer for Life magazine, was my first interview. I met him at a fancy restaurant of his choice, and within minutes the conversation turned to violence, making the setting feel wrong. This happened many times over the years. In the interview, Wasser recounted one of the saddest days of his life. Days after the murders, as a part of an editorial for Life, Wasser had accompanied Roman Polanski on his first return visit to the house on Cielo Drive. I cannot imagine walking back into that scene. I mean, how does that work? How do you get your stuff? I mean, that's where he lived. His things were there, her things were there. But you have to go back into that horrific scene. I don't know how anyone does it, to be honest. One of Wasser's pictures from that day showed Polanski sitting slumped on the front porch of the home, his eyes carefully averted from the faded word pig written in his wife's blood on the door. It was too soon, Wasser told me. He shadowed Polanski as he moved through the blood-stained rooms. So yeah, nobody comes and cleans up the blood. Like, they don't send someone in to do that. They just clear the scene and leave the mess for the family. I guess that's how it works. But that's horrifying. It wasn't a home anymore. It was evidence. There was still evidence of the crime. Nothing had been cleaned up. I cannot imagine. Right away, Wasser regretted the assignment, but Polanski wanted him there, even at his most vulnerable moment. Wasser was hired to get photos to give to a psychic, so he could get psychic vibrations from them. I mean, I guess if they didn't know who it was at that time, maybe you're grasping at straws. You might think that that's something that would help you find some answers, but I don't know. I don't believe in psychics personally, but who knows if you're in that mindset. I mean, you might be just reaching for anything, right? Polanski led them to the nursery, which had been furnished and decorated in anticipation of the baby. Roman went over to the bassinet and just started crying. It was the saddest thing I've ever seen. I've never seen anything, in my mind, so intrusive, going into this pregnant woman's bedroom and knowing what happened there. He had sold it. Oh, the psychic didn't share in this sense of solemnity. He had sold his copies of the photos to the Hollywood Citizen News. So Polanski wanted this photographer to go in with him so he could give these photos to a psychic to help him figure out what happened. And the psychic sold the photos. See, that I don't trust psychics. But I don't know. That's not good. Not good. Wasser described the great fear that descended on LA after the murders. No one would even answer their doors. I heard that a lot in my first interviews. Sales of burglar alarms and security systems had skyrocketed after the murders, and people were quick to ditch their drug stashes. Others took more drastic precautions. At the funeral of Jay Sebring, Steve McQueen carried a pistol in his belt. The actor was in the throes of an anxiety that pervaded Hollywood, where everyone suspected that the killer might be among them. It's true, if you don't know who did it, it could be anyone. It had to be terrifying. Frank Sinatra hired a full-time security guard for months. The whole tone of the city defined fear. And like I said, it had to. You have no idea why this happened, who could have done it. You might think you're going to be next. There's this famous actress there, and there's tons of actors and actresses in LA. They were probably all greatly on edge. In 1999, apparently, that fear was still alive and well, at least among Hollywood's A-list, many of whom declined to speak to me, even though 30 years had passed. As the rejections piled up, I had my own bout of paranoia. Had some memo gone out? My request had asked simply if they'd like to discuss the after effects of the murders on their community. It didn't feel like I was prying. And Premiere, since it was dedicated entirely to the movie business, usually garnered some enthusiasm from this crowd. All told, more than 36 people turned me down. Some were household names, but plenty of the non-famous found reasons to decline too. It was looking like I'd have a story about Hollywood with no one from Hollywood in it. Hoping for something more, I went to less well-known names. Peter Bart, the longtime editor-in-chief of Variety, had been close to Polanski, and what he told me gave me a small lead. I must confess that the crowd was a little scary, Bart said, referring to Polanski and Tate's circle. There was an aura of danger around them. There was an instinctive feeling that everyone was pushing it and things were getting out of control. Okay, so pushing what? Drugs? Sex? Something else? Like, what are they pushing? It doesn't really elaborate here. I'd like to know. My wife and I still talk about it, he said. Anybody who underestimates the impact of the events is full of shit. This was my first taste of the live freaky, die freaky view, the idea that Polanski's circle, with its wild parties and flexible morals, had brought about their own murders. I thought there might be something here. After all, the murders hadn't been solved, and the victims had done seemingly nothing to instigate them. Or did they? But Bart and others I'd soon speak to still claimed that their lifestyles were to blame. I had to get closer to those who'd known Sharon and Roman, anyone who'd attended these supposedly lurid parties. But the rejections kept coming. I mentioned the rash of rejection to Peter Bart. His observations stayed with me, especially as the months wore on, and I began to see that Manson might have been more plugged into Hollywood than anyone cared to admit. Just the fact that they're all saying no, he said, is fascinating. Now, what strikes me as weird is how does this, virtual nobody, if he is, that's how he's portrayed, just move around in the Hollywood circles? I mean, I know it's a different time, but I can't imagine just popping into Hollywood and inserting myself in with all these celebrities. It seems strange. Okay, Bugliosi's first slip. There was one major player who agreed to talk to me, Vincent Bugliosi. Not only did he sign on for an interview, he invited me to his new home in Pasadena, the same one where years later he would threaten to hurt me if I published my findings. There was no sign of animosity during our first meeting. He gave me 6 hours of his time and drove me around to show me various landmarks related to the crime and enjoying a long lunch with me in one of his favorite restaurants. I was flattered to have captured his attention. Here was the man who'd put away one of the greatest monsters of the 20th century. Later, I would question the motive behind his generosity, because he wants to control the narrative is what I'm guessing is the case here. A prosecutor makes a lot of enemies over the course of his career, and Bugliosi made more than most. Considering that he'd once fielded death threats from Manson himself, he lived in a surprisingly unprotected home. He and his wife were just moving in when I visited that April of 1999. Bugliosi was a fast talker. He sent a tsunami of words in my direction, sometimes jumping out of his chair for no apparent reason. His wife was very quiet. I caught her rolling her eyes as he told me the movie version of Helter Skelter from 1976 was #1 that year. She probably heard these stories over and over and over. He'd basically been on a 30-year victory lap and had his talking points down. It was hard to get him off script, which is exactly what he wanted him to do, He knows, he's read Helter Skelter, he knows that is the script, so he wants other things. On the surface, he seemed chatty and forthcoming, but everything he said for hours was canned. I tried to probe at the holes I'd noticed in Helter Skelter. For one, how had the cops missed so many clues in this case? Why hadn't they solved it much sooner? Bugliosi blamed sloppy police work and said they never would have figured it out without him. He's got a little complex, superiority complex. I questioned him on the caretaker and Terry Melcher, looking for answers that he wouldn't give. Bugliosi dodged those questions, instead reiterating the terror that Melcher felt during the trial and for years afterward. Fearing that Manson or someone from the family still wanted him dead, I asked if he could put me in touch with Melcher, and that seemed to unnerve him a bit. Why? He said I'd have a hard time getting him to talk. Later, when I did manage to track down Melcher, I'd find out why. So, what was Bugliosi hiding or worried about? As the sun was setting after many hours of talk, I asked Bugliosi if he could share anything with me about the case that had never been reported before. I could see that he was really thinking about it. I asked him about an article I'd read about some questionable movies being made up at the Tate House, and about an account of a drug dealer being tied up and beaten at a party there. I was curious why these accounts hadn't made it into Helter Skelter. I mean, to be fair, books, you can't put everything in a book. So is he leaving stuff out on purpose, or is it, just to keep the book concise? He seemed to be in some kind of internal debate. After a long silence, he told me to turn my recorder off and said, "This can never be attributed to me. It will be explained later why I'm treating this as on the record." Bugliosi stated that they'd recovered some videotape at the house, clearly filmed by Polanski, that depicted Sharon Tate being forced to sleep with two men. Some of these words I'm changing to make them less gross. Bugliosi never saw the tape, but he told the detectives to put it back where they found it. He wrote in Helter Skelter that an officer saw Polanski put a videotape in his pocket later. This revelation gave more weight to the live freaky, die freaky motto. Bugliosi said that Polanski was a sicko, that he was making her do it. This was my first piece of new evidence, and I hoped I could verify it. In my haste to keep reporting, I failed to see that the revelation came with a slip-up on his part, one that would take me more than 6 years to recognize. He couldn't have told the detectives to put the tape back. He wasn't assigned to the Tate case until November of 1969, months after Polanski's August 17 visit to the house. If he learned about the tape from the detectives back in August, if he'd been the one as claimed who ordered its return to the house, then something in the police investigation had necessitated his involvement much earlier than he'd ever acknowledged. Maybe it was nothing, maybe it was something he felt he had to cover up to protect some celebrities' reputations. We would never know because he kept it hidden from his readers. Ugliness and purity. Before I get to that, I for some reason just thought of the O.J. Simpson case and how for years he got by with some pretty horrifying things, and it was really down to his celebrity. Cops, they're just mortals like you and me. They're gonna have some stars in their eyes for these celebrities, and I feel like O.J. Simpson got sort of covered for by cops. Maybe this is something similar. I don't know. All right, ugliness and purity. Helter Skelter opens with a famous sentence. It was so quiet, one of the killers would later say, you could almost hear the sound of ice rattling in cocktail shakers in the homes down the canyon. The first half of the book portrays the dread of that scene. Given Bugliosi's revelation to me, it was the first place I started looking for a break. If he had changed one detail about the case, could he have changed others? That question would keep coming up throughout my investigation. The LAPD had assigned 2 separate teams of detectives to the cases, one for the Tate murders and one for the LaBiancas. Despite the similarities in the crimes, the LAPD had concluded that the LaBiancas were the victims of a copycat crime. There was seemingly little in common between the sets of victims. The police fanned out in what would become the largest murder investigation in LA history. The LaBianca team operated in relative anonymity. The press couldn't muster much interest in their case, at least not when Sharon Tate's killer was on the loose. Now that's kind of sad. I mean, it's typical, but they didn't lump the cases together, and the LaBiancas didn't even get much of a recognition because they were just kind of nobodies compared to Sharon Tate. It's kind of sad. On the other side of town, the Cielo crime scene was like a carnival. 21 men were assigned to the case. Helicopters hovered and guards stood watch around the clock. Detectives moved to lock down their initial suspect right away. William Garrison, the lone survivor of the night's massacre, was dragged out of the guest house, shoved into a patrol car, and driven straight to headquarters, where he was read his rights and charged with 5 murders. This is a 19-year-old kid, you guys. Garrison was only 19. He couldn't explain why he hadn't heard anything that night, other than the fact that he had the radio on. So this is the guy that, if you remember the first kid, Stephen Parent, the 18-year-old, who was in the wrong place at the wrong time for sure. He was visiting this guy to try to sell him a clock on the night that everything happened. After 3 days, the police concluded that he was just a slow kid in the wrong place at the wrong time. In those same first 24 hours, the Tate detectives got a tip from a friend of one of the victims, Witold Kasanowski. He was scared and in hiding. He was tracked down and eventually told the police that he believed that Frykowski had been involved in the drug trade with a host of career criminals. One of these was a man named Pick Dawson, who had at a recent party threatened to kill Frykowski. The guy thought that the word pick was spelled in blood on the door, P-I-C. The police found him credible after finding out that Pick Dawson had been involved at an altercation at the Cielo house the past spring. The police hoped to ask Polanski about this when he arrived back in the States. From the airport, he was put into a waiting car and taken to a suite on the Paramount Studios lot. But before he arrived, Polanski had the car stopped at a Denny's parking lot for a hushed conversation with Kasanowski. This was never reported by Bugliosi, and something I felt worth exploring. Is it even important, and was it really expected for every tiny little thing to make it into the book, though? Did Bugliosi know about this? Did he know about it and think it was nothing, or was he trying to conceal something? I mean, a lot of details are often cut out of books, so I'm trying to give Bugliosi the benefit of the doubt here, for now. After they chatted at Denny's, Kasanowski got in the car and headed to Paramount with Polanski. When the LAPD arrived at the studio that evening, they were barred from entering Polanski's suite until he finished debriefing. Now, what does that even mean? Like, you can just hold the police off and say, I'm debriefing, I'm going to need a few minutes. I mean, who is he debriefing with? I'm confused about that. I don't know. What do you guys think? Bugliosi also didn't think to mention this in his book. So this is making Polanski look a little bit sketchy. 2 of Polanski's friends confirmed the secret Denny's meeting and interviews with me. Both defended it as a simple exchange of information between 2 longtime friends. And yet, Polanski denied knowing Kasanowski at all in the polygraph test. So maybe there is something to it. Sensing there was more to this story, I sought out Kasanowski, who had never spoken to reporters about the murders. Somewhat to my surprise, he agreed to discuss the case with me. He said that the Denny's meeting did happen, but there wasn't much to it. He'd only answered some of Polanski's questions about Frykowski's possible drug dealing, and admitted that his suspicion about Pick Dawson had amounted to nothing. And yet it was easy to see how Frykowski may have gotten in over his head in those months before the murders. It was a turbulent time at the Cielo house. When Tate and Polanski left, they gave Frykowski and Folger the run on the place, and things got weird. The couple threw parties all the time. The door was open to anyone and everyone. Again, this seems interesting. I mean, you wouldn't think anyone and everyone would be invited to some fancy, celebrity, rich people Hollywood party. These are the special people around town. The crowds grew rowdier, the drugs got harder, including cocaine, mescaline, LSD, and MDA, which at the time was a new synthetic drug that Frykowski was particularly fond of. This Frykowski guy was quite a bit of a drug addict, I'm gathering from what I've read. And Abigail Folger was his girlfriend and a user as well. But I think they were all users. I mean, maybe everyone at that time was, I don't know. Dawson, Doyle, and Harrigan, the same trio that had been booted from the party in March, were now regular guests. They also supplied most of the drugs. Frykowski wanted in on the drug market and reportedly negotiated a deal with his new friends, making himself a middleman between them and Hollywood. So he's trying to profit off of this. I met up with Kasanowski in LA. He'd been the last of Frykowski's friends to see him alive. He said that he had intended to visit the Tate house that night, but he was too tired. Well, that was probably the luckiest decision he ever made in his life, huh? He showed me a manila envelope of memorabilia, and it seemed to take him back in time. He said that the usual indicators of class and status had disappeared in Hollywood at the time. Okay, so that makes more sense, like why anybody would be at these parties, right? It's hard to imagine now, but maybe that's how it was at the time. Where the most extreme ugliness with total purity was mixed up. This blurriness was the inevitable outcome of the open door policy they'd all subscribed to at the end of the 60s. Totally primitive, uneducated people could dream and act like visionary artists, and you couldn't know absolutely who was who. You could have a Manson and you could have the great poet, and it was impossible to make a distinction. Kasanowski remembered so many strange people coming and going from the house on Cielo Drive, where he would sometimes stay with Frykowski for days at a stretch. I didn't trust them, he said of the guests. They walked so freely through the place. I've always wondered about this, how these, famous people were associating with riffraff, but I guess we were just kind of explained that, but it is hard to wrap your mind around. Practically homeless people, drug addicts, just chilling with, these fancy rich celebrities. All right, he who dies with the most toys wins. Having finished what would be her final film, The 13 Chairs, Sharon Tate came back to the Cielo house in July 1969, more than 7 months pregnant. She wanted to have her baby in the house she loved, but Polanski, who was supposed to have returned by then, deferred his homecoming. He needed to continue scouting locations for his next film. Assuring her that he'd be back in time for the baby's arrival, he asked his old friend Frykowski to stick around with Folger and keep Tate company. I'm sure that's exactly who I want around when I'm waiting to have a baby, is a bunch of drug addicts. But I guess if that's your friends, maybe you wouldn't think anything of it. That, at least, is the version Bugliosi provides. Once I'd heard from him about Polanski's tape and the seedier side of Cielo, I started pushing harder in my interviews, and diverging stories developed. Polanski's friend said that Tate was grateful for the company. She didn't want to be alone in the secluded estate, especially at the end of her pregnancy. As for Polanski himself, his friends described him as careful, conservative, even square, and deeply in love with his wife. I've heard many different stories than that. I don't know if you all know, he's not allowed in the United States because of doing some pretty horrific things. If he said he had to stay on in London for work, then that's what he was doing. Others remembered it differently. Tate had been horrified at the scene that greeted her upon her return to LA. She was leery of Folger and especially of Frykowski, whom she suspected of drug dealing. Rightly so, it sounds like. She wanted the couple and the crowd attached to them out of her house. As I won the confidence of some of her closest friends, they came out with intensely disturbing stories. Her marriage was in shambles, they said, and many of them didn't want her to fix it. They wanted her to leave it. Polanski had established a pattern of abuse, emotional and physical. The Sharon Tate they knew, warm and vivacious, was diminished in his presence. The difference in Sharon was incredible. She just wasn't herself when she was with him. She was in awe or frightened. He had an awesome charisma. He kind of looks creepy to me, but I guess the only pictures I really see of him are from back then, so I don't know. That meant that Polanski could walk all over her. One friend, who called him one of the most evil people I've ever met, said that he had smashed Tate's face into a mirror and on another occasion forced her to watch a recording of him having sex with another woman. That's just disgusting. Why? He cheated on her constantly, and he made sure she knew about it. Another friend remembered an incident in which Polanski had asked his wife to wear the same dress that one of his other lovers had worn. What a jerk. What a disgusting pig, if it's true. When she appeared in her own dress instead, he threw her into the pool in front of her friends. Others said that Polanski hosted orgies at the house without his wife's knowledge or consent. I will never understand that. That's so gross. Dominic Dunn, who'd been close to Tate Polanski and Jay Sebring, was confident on that point. I never went to their orgies, but I know they existed, and I think Jay was in on it too. The director James Toback, who would himself be disgraced nearly 20 years later by more than 200 allegations of sexual assault, was even more certain. And yet, James Toback is full of shit and has always been. Paul Silbert, a production designer and friend of Polanski, told me. Okay, so there's a lot of back and forth here. We don't know what's true. Nothing crazy went on up there. There were no orgies, none that I have ever been to, and I was up there frequently. He conceded that Polanski was peculiar, but whatever his kinkiness was, it was on a small scale and quite private. He might have been hinting at orgies, but there never were any. Maybe he just didn't get invited to them. I don't know. Orgies or no, at a certain point, Tate felt that she'd suffered enough. As the humiliations accumulated, she approached Elkie Summer for her advice. Summer remembered telling her, "I'd take the next heavy object, whether it's an iron or a frying pan or a spade out in the yard, and I'd just brain him." Tate wasn't about to do that, but she did on a few occasions warm to the idea of leaving Polanski. Summer thought she was always too much in her husband's thrall to follow through. "There was a tremendous sickness when I worked with Sharon," Summer said. "A horrendous sickness surrounding her relationship. She was quite lost." That's very sad. A number of Tate's friends were quick to mention the undesirable company she kept, with Frykowski and Folger at the top of the list. "Tate couldn't stand them," said Joanna Pettit, another actress who'd become close to her. The two had had lunch together at the house on the day of the murders. Can you imagine the next day seeing that on the news and being like, oh my gosh, I was just there. Like, what? Pettit was surprised to see Frykowski and Folger, whom she'd never met before, walking around like they owned the place. I asked, "Who are these people? Why are they here?" She said, "Roman didn't want me to be alone." Tate tolerated the pair only because her husband insisted on it. On the phone with Polanski, so depressed that she fell into tears, she complained that the two had brought too many drugs into the house, too much chaos. But Polanski refused to turn them out. She asked constantly when he would come home, but he kept postponing his return trip. Moreover, she tried to stay with him in London, but he wouldn't let her. He didn't want her there. That just makes me so sad for her. Had gone to great lengths to track down Pettit, who had quit the movie business in the 90s. She lived in the high desert beyond Palm Springs, where she was something of a recluse with no phone. It had dawned on me that I might be able to reach her through the Screen Actors Guild. They would have her address on file, since they were responsible for mailing her residual checks. Through them, I sent her a long letter, and she agreed to meet me for lunch at a strip mall near her house. She was slightly apprehensive when she first arrived. Then, 57, she cut a striking figure, dressed head to toe in denim, with dark glasses that obscured her piercing eyes, until she felt comfortable enough to remove them. Head to toe in denim, that's a funny sight. "I lost it when Sharon was killed," she said. "I had to be hospitalized and missed the funeral." She made no attempt to conceal her contempt for Polanski. "I hated him," she said flatly. As others had, Pettit described a marriage in which he exuded an almost casual cruelty toward his wife. That's awful. For 4 months in the summer of 67, Pettit had stayed with a couple at a rented beach house, and she began to notice how often Polanski bossed Tate around. He had a malicious streak. Sometimes it reached Pettit herself. He would throw a brick in the pool and watch my dog dive for it and try to retrieve it. He stood there laughing. The dog wouldn't give up. That is sadistic. You're just for your own sick pleasure. You're going to throw a brick in a pool for this dog that's not going to give up. I mean, that is just sick. That's sick. After Sharon's funeral, Polanski called Pettit. On the phone, he was strange with me, cold as ice. There was no despair, and I was sobbing. He wanted to know what she told the police, so maybe there is something he's hiding. It made her wonder what was behind her friend's murder. At the time, I suspected it was maybe friends of his who did it. All I know is he never came when she asked him to come back, and she was here. Figuring that Polanski's confidants would want to tell a different story, I coaxed Bill Tennant, his manager, into talking to me. Tennant had never given an interview about the murders, in part because of the events of 1969. The events of 1969 had sent his life into a tailspin. Yeah, there's a lot of collateral damage from this, I'm sure. He had the somber task of identifying the bodies at the Tate House. A 1993 piece in Variety described Tennant's fall from grace. Through the 60s and 70s, he found great success in Hollywood. But Bart had found him a gaunt, battered figure, sleeping in a doorway on Ventura Boulevard. A cocaine addiction had done away with his marriage and his money, leading him to trade even the gold inlays in his teeth for a fix. In Bart's assessment, the shock of the Manson murders began unraveling him. I tracked down Tennant in London, where he was sober and remarried. I guess there's a little bit of a happy ending there for someone. He'd become a born-again Christian, but he displayed little compassion or forgiveness for Polanski, his one-time client and friend. Roman is a shit, he said, echoing what I'd heard from other friends of the couple. Tennant said there were two versions of their story. Which one do you want to tell? On one hand, Polanski had fallen into disillusion in London, where he was working on a movie and sleeping around, while back in California, his pregnant wife was putting together a home. Tate wound up getting murdered because he was fucking around in London, he said. But that was just one side of it. The other story is sitting in the Bel Air Hotel with Roman after the funerals and having to address his financial situation, which was not good. Tennant said, and Roman looking across the table at me and saying, I wish I had spent more. I wish I had bought her more dresses. I wish I had given more gifts. So what story do you want to tell? The one about this little prick who left his wife alone? With Jay Sebring and Gibby Folger and Wojtek, these wankers, these four tragic losers? Or do you want to talk about a poor kid, Roman Polanski? So, doesn't sound like a lot of people have too much nice to say about him. Tennant resisted the idea that the murders represented a loss of innocence for Hollywood. There was nothing innocent about it, he said. It was retribution. The big value in Los Angeles when he was there, Tennant said, was this. He who dies with the most toys wins. I think it's pretty self-serving to call that period and what was going on innocent. What's innocent about drugs? What's innocent about promiscuous sex? You tell me where the innocence was. Within a week of the murders, Polanski was partying it up with Warren Beatty, he added, within a week of the murders. Yikes. The brutal reality was that nobody cared or gave a shit about Sharon Tate, not because they weren't nice, but because she was expendable. After his wife's murder, Polanski stayed on the Paramount Studios lot as much as he could. It was the only place he felt safe, and not just from killers or the media, from the LAPD. Ooh, interesting. You found the police surveillance units, and you found that police in Los Angeles knew everything about everybody. That there was a kind of FBI/CIA aspect of the LA Police Department, and that they knew everything there was to know. Although we had no way of knowing it, in 1969, Tennant wasn't being paranoid when he wondered how the LAPD knew so much about his friends. Many law enforcement agencies, including the LAPD, the LA County Sheriff's Office, and the FBI, had maintained units to surveil and even infiltrate groups that they considered subversive or threatening. At this stage, I wasn't inclined to view law enforcement with anything approaching suspicion. Even so, I was beginning to see the official version of the case with a jaundiced eye. So this is where O'Neill starts to get suspicious and feels something isn't quite right. The official narrative is maybe not quite right. So yeah, I think Operation Chaos was a CIA operation. I will look up the exact details of it, but where they infiltrated activist groups and whatnot back at that time. But I hope you guys are getting interested in this. I know I've seen we haven't had quite as many views, and I know not everyone wanted this book, but I am glad for the ones of you that are sticking around. I promise it gets interesting. I'm trying not to focus on the gore too much, but it is an interesting story, and the official narrative is probably not actually what happened. So I think you guys are going to find it interesting. Thanks again for sticking around with me. What do you guys think of Roman Polanski? I think he's a scoundrel, but that's because I'm on this, this side of the timeline where I know other horrible things he's done in his life. So I don't know, maybe he's a good guy, maybe he's a bad guy. Maybe he was a bad guy, but you could still feel a little sorry for him because, his wife and baby were lost. But I don't know, partying it up a week after, I really don't know how to, that can't be excused in my mind. All right, guys, I hope you're enjoying this. Take care. I will see you in the next one. Bye.